check.
Okay.
He should be introduced from where? Over by the pianos where he should be. Do you want to stand or you could just take that?
Yeah, you can just take this. It's on, so turn it off. Good morning. I'm Bill Craddock, a member of Calvary and part of the Calvary Adult Education Program. We have a very special guest from the Virginia Theological Seminary, the Dean, to speak to us today. And I'd like to introduce him this way, if I could. A recent opinion article in the New York Times by Tish Warren carried the headline, "Is America willing to tell the truth about its history?" She writes that there is, of course, nothing wrong with being white. God designed the specific amount of melanin in my skin. But America has and has always had an idolatry of white culture and power. Our history makes that clear. The actual historical facts of slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, and racial inequality are likely to make white Americans, with even a hint of compassion, feel uncomfortable. In reading her article, of course, it made me feel uncomfortable and even aware of a community guilt that we white folks, speaking for myself, had whitewashed and sanitized our early American experiment, our collective sins towards people of color. This morning, about 30 minutes ago, I was reading the New York Times Digital, and there's a book review of a book out called The 1619 Project. And in the review, it said that the White Lion, a cargo ship, landed in Virginia a year before the Mayflower. and the cargo were slaves. I didn't know that. It was whitewashed. Repentance for sin is not simply to feel sorry about something, but to actively address and repair the wrong that's been done. Actions speak louder than words. For example, Calvary's work to mark the slave market in our corner of 3rd and Adams, only about 200 yards from where you are sitting right now. Confronting the truth is a mission of the church. We are known for a strong call for justice. And we're honored today to have with us Dean Ian Markham, who has taken a bold step in addressing reparations at the Virginia Theological Seminary. The Very Reverend Ian Markham, Ph.D., was appointed as Dean and President of Virginia Theological Seminary in August 2007. He completed his Ph.D. at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, where he focused on Christian ethics. He previously earned an M.Lit in Philosophy and Ethics from the University of Cambridge and a B.D. in Theology from the University of London. Before being called to VTS, he served as Dean and Professor of Theology and Ethics at Hartford Seminary in Connecticut and visiting Professor of Globalization, Ethics, and Islam at Leeds Metropolitan University in the United Kingdom. I had lunch with Dean Markham yesterday, and I found out also he is a very enthusiast Liverpool football. That's soccer. And I hope they won. Last I heard it was 4-0. But Dean, we're delighted to have you, and welcome to Calvary.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you. I truly feel privileged to do this work. And thank you for that very warm introduction, and thank you to the Rector for this opportunity to be with you this morning. So, as you can probably deduce, my accent is, I'm not from Tennessee or Mississippi. My accent is actually from England. So you might be wondering, what is this white Englishman talking about American history? And I appreciate that question. So let me just explain that in God's providence, I was given the privilege and responsibility of being the Dean and President of Virginia Theological Seminary, which is an institution that's responsible for 2 fine priests in our midst. It is also an institution that is on the cusp of marking 200 years. And therefore, one of the responsibilities of my tenure is to think a little bit about what does that look like? How does an institution mark 200 years? And that will be the theme of this brief presentation. I want to welcome those who are viewing online. It's lovely to have you with us. And I understand you're able to send questions through the chat. And I understand anybody in the room who wishes to ask a question, simply wait your way to the mic so those at home can hear what you're asking. So, Virginia Theological Seminary has been in the business of the so-called council culture for decades, it must be said. And what do I mean by that? We counseled the culture of large numbers of African Americans who played a pivotal role in our history. In fact, they did everything, it must be said. They washed all the clothes, they built all the buildings, they cared for the land, they cared for the animals, they served at the tables. They literally did everything. And this part of the narrative was simply cancelled by the institution. And that's because, of course, you know, in the end, we want to tell a different story. We want to tell a story how, at our founding, Virginia Theological Seminary saw the need to raise up vocations and clergy for the Episcopal Church, and slowly together, people worked hard to create what is now the strongest seminary in the Anglican Communion. That was the narrative we wanted to tell. And we would mention in passing, yes, there was slavery, yes, there was Jim Crow, but it would be a sort of addendum. It would be a footnote to the history. But we now know that that's not faithful to the institution we're called to be. We're called to be people who do the hard work of remembrance. Remember, that is a primary theme of the Christian tradition. What do we do every Sunday? We do these things in remembrance of me, says our Lord Jesus Christ. What does the commandments, as they're given to the Jewish people, what are they told to do? They're told to remember the commandments and to put them on their foreheads and on their forearms. Because the act of remembrance is the only way the past stays present. And therefore, you either remember or you forget. It's a binary. And we're called, as an act of faithfulness, to remember. So we started work bi-directionally. By that I mean we started work by working with the local African American communities and discovering from them what they knew, and of course they knew a great deal. And we also started with primary sources, sources in our archives, records of the Board of Trustees, and also correspondence elsewhere in Alexandria. The first name we found was Julia Parker. Julia was born in 1823, the year of our founding. At the tender age of 21, the seminary paid John Augustus Washington III, who was the great-grandnephew of George Washington, who then owned Mount Vernon. We paid him the princely sum of $11 for 3 months' labor of Julia Parker. Now, my son Luke is 25. I know what a 21-year-old looks like. And the very act of learning the name and learning the age, and with a simple act of empathy, just imagining what it must have been like as she was separated from her parents who were also enslaved and turned into a commodity that was purchased by a Christian institution to provide labor, and none of her labor was rewarded. She was never paid for the work she did. These are all the names we've subsequently discovered as persons who worked on the campus in the period before the Civil War. Many of these families lived near the seminary and still do. And one important feature of all this, which I had no idea about, and for which I admit I made a mistake, I had no idea the depth of anger in the African American community around us that we had never reached out. There were families in literally just 2 miles away, a mile away from the seminary, whose forebears had worked on the campus right up until 1970, 1980. And they were not recognized, and they weren't honored, and the connection was not there. So we've been working hard to build bridges with that community, and an important part of that bridge building is discovering the number of Terrells who live in the neighborhood, the number of Wanzas who live in the neighborhood, all these connections that we had never really sought to honor in our story. The seminary, Alexandria, was a key place, and there are probably actual connections between this institution and the market of enslaved persons on this block and Virginia Theological Seminary. Alexandria was a key port for the movement of people around the country. And one thing we're discovering in all this is exactly how that business operated. These are illustrative ads. A runaway slave entitled Carter, euphemistically called servants, but actually the desire for persons who are enslaved, and the documentation and the prices that are being paid. All of this is part of our record as an institution. But the interesting thing, I meet with every single descendant who we find, and one of the most important parts of the conversation, is an invitation for them to reflect on their forebears and the memories they had of those people. And you discover rich lives, rich and beautiful lives that were lived despite the injustice and oppression that they were living with. And you discover photographs, and you discover anecdotes, and you cover stories, and people cry as they take the opportunity to remember somebody important in their lives that nobody had ever bothered to ask them about before. So we're coming up to an anniversary of some significance. 200 years we've been working as an institution. We were founded in 1823, and therefore enslaved persons played a pivotal role. We know, for example, that Aspinwall Hall was built by enslaved labour, and given the size and scale of that building in the 19th century, we can anticipate there would have been significant injury and probably fatalities as that building was built. In addition, all the other labour required by the seminary was provided by persons who were enslaved. And then, of course, you move into the Jim Crow period, and we know that there was a discrepancy in payments of up to African Americans were paid 1/5 of what their white counterparts were paid. So the salaries were dramatically different from their white counterparts. So we decided that we would announce a Reparations Fund. I'll be honest with you, it's modest. 1.7 million was approximately, as of then, 1% of our endowment. But we were going to set aside this fund, which would be invested, and the 4% draw would be available for distribution. And we weren't sure exactly what it would be used for. At the point when we announced this in 2019, we had no idea we had not found any descendants. What we decided to do is, lots of institutions did the research and then decided what they wanted to do. We decided, okay, we'll create a fund to do whatever the research requires us to do. So we worked that way round. So the fund was announced. And let me just stress, we didn't do this because we wanted to be a poster child for reparations. We did this because we were trying to do the right thing. And actually, the initial news of this was only distributed to 2 news outlets. The magazine The Living Church, which has a subscriber base of 5,000 persons, and the Episcopal News Service. And that's where we stopped, because we weren't trying to do this to get attention to ourselves. We were trying to do what we felt God was calling us to do in the moment, and because we were trying to think through the true implications of our history. Nevertheless, the Episcopal News Service shared it with the world, and before I knew where I was, there I was on the cover of, well, in the New York Times. It wasn't on the cover. So how do we do this work? Well, one of the most important parts of this is to tell the complete story. And therefore, we've got, these are the key people. We have a research team who are specialists, genealogists. Shahbar works primarily with the local communities back to the past. And then Elizabeth and Maddie and Chris, they work with the archival sources forward. Chris Pote is our archivist who oversees our collection. And then we have an implementation team which comes out of the Office of Multicultural Ministries, led by the Reverend Dr. Joe Thompson and Ms. Ebony Davis, who are responsible for when we have a name and when we have data that they are descendants of somebody who worked on the campus, both in Jim Crow and before the Civil War. We actually then start building bridges with those families, and that's the work primarily of Ebony. So you can sort of see the division of duties, and this is a significant undertaking by the seminary. But again, we're marking 200 years. So it's a significant undertaking that we do as an act of faithfulness to telling the complete story of the past, so that nobody's cancelled, and that all people who are part of the journey are appropriately recognised. So we now have the Jim Crow persons. Again, you know, these people often laboured for decades on the campus. Jacob, Rebecca, Cora, Rebecca, Norman, Leon, Robert, John, George, Charles, Edmonia, Joseph, Daniel, Fanny, Wilma, and Willie Mae. It's interesting. Up until 6 months ago, their names were never listed. They weren't in our publications. They weren't part of the story. They weren't listed. And I know that you, as a congregation, did a comparable exercise in a liturgy, as you too remembered names of people who've hitherto been forgotten, and did the exercise of naming the names and allowing the words to fill the air so that their lives were finally recognized. It's been really interesting as the descendants have got to know about the program. We've had a spectrum of reactions. We've had people who just say, look, too little, too late, I'm not interested. Or too little, too late, and thank you for the payment, but that's where it's going to stop. I'm not interested in the relationship. All the way through to people who say, I'm really pleased somebody's doing something. And one thing they all ask for, because these families interconnect over decades and generationally, they suddenly said, one thing we would love is a lunch at the seminary. So there they are. They gathered on July the 30th, 2021. Originally, it was going to be a small, modest lunch in 1823. We have a little pub on the campus. And it was such that the attendance was so strong, it overflowed out into the refectory. And they loved being together. And one important part of this program is every single descendant you see there is entitled to faculty emeritus status. So what that means is they're allowed to dine in our refectory whenever they wish, anytime during our refectory is open Mondays to Fridays for lunch, and they're allowed to dine there during the semesters. And I'm looking forward to them really taking advantage of that. That's an important part of this. We want them to be part of our community going forward. Now, one interesting thing about all this is the extent to which the Episcopal Church is enmeshed in the ownership of persons who are enslaved and the industry of that. And that is salutary. That is a reminder of our deep complicity and participation in sin. And a lot of the work is dealing with correspondence. So this is indeed a letter from John Augustus Washington III. This is a typical example of a primary source. And you can sort of see this is an instruction to Nellie, his wife, telling her to deliver Millie at the seminary to Mr. Bland. And also the preoccupation with the importance of the bonds being signed. Mr. Moore has not given his bonds for Ginny, so he cannot have her. You know, these human lives are commodities to be just used. One shocking thing about all this is we were under the impression that we didn't really have much documentation as a school to work with. We sort of thought that we would be looking elsewhere, but actually embedded in our archives are the records of board meetings. We always knew them and we had consulted them for other purposes. But suddenly we were consulting them and finding all sorts of things in them. Carter Dowling, so this is quite interesting. So you have on the one side an enslaved person escaping from the seminary, 23 years old, and then you have the record as he arrived at a station where he tells his story. So you can sort of see the efforts the seminary go to actually get Carter back. And then you have the record of Carter, who, accompanied by Richard, had just reached his majority. He stated that he'd escaped from a maiden lady living in Alexandria, known by the name of Mrs. Fitzhugh, the owner of 25 slaves. Opposed to slavery as he was, he nevertheless found no fault with his mistress, but on the contrary said she was a very respectable lady and a member of the Episcopal Church. She often spoke of freeing her servants when she died. Such talk was too uncertain for Carter to pin his faith to, and he resolved not to wait. Such slaveholders generally lived a great while, and when they did die, they many times failed to keep their promises. He concluded to heed the voice of reason and at once leave the house of bondage. His mother, father, 5 brothers and 6 sisters, all owned by Mrs. Fitzhugh, formed a strong tie to keep him from going. He conferred not with flesh and blood, but made a determined stroke for freedom. Now, the story of our racism does indeed extend into the Jim Crow era. These minutes are extraordinary. There are all sorts of interesting things about the minutes in total. So this is 1944. Bishop Goodwin would have been present at this board meeting. The dean and president of the seminary would have been Zabriskie, Alexander Zabriskie. Henry St. George Tucker, who went on to be presiding bishop, was present in the room. They had a variety of discussions. The total operating budget of the seminary then was $50,000. They were in conversations with Episcopal Divinity School in Philadelphia for possible merger talks. But embedded in the record is this motion offered by Mr. Burke, who runs Burke and Herbert, a local bank, that the executive committee be authorized to buy the property of the late Douglas Johnson. Now, Douglas Johnson was a free man who was African American, adjacent to the entrance gate of the seminary. And then, what follows is just, you sort of think, did nobody pause? Did nobody say, is this right? Did nobody, when they approved the minutes, say, do we want to think of something different to say here? It's just stated explicitly and uncomplicatedly. Mr. Burke stated that the purpose of this resolution was to prevent the development of a Negro settlement in the near vicinity of the seminary. So our task then is to face up to this, and sure, it's hard. Facing up to sin always is hard. But we are now doing that work. And as you can see, we have the implementation protocols. We follow up with each family. We confirm the research. We share the program details, which I'll describe in just a moment. We discuss commemorating their ancestor. We're very interested in, would they like a plaque where their names are listed? How would you like their story to be told? We invite the descendants to meet with me, and we discuss wishes for share of the fund and other potential requests. And this is me meeting some of the descendants. Gerald Wanzer, when I met with him, he's one of the earliest, he said to me, I said, is there anything else we can do? He said, well, we're in the middle of COVID, but I'm 77 years old. I would love a party at the seminary. So I said, sure, we'll put on a party. So it was a small party, because it would have to be, of course, it's COVID. So we invited primarily his immediate family and some guests from the seminary, and my wife and I hosted it. And beforehand, he said, I would love to be shown around the campus. So I took him to the chapel, and I took him to Addison, and we showed him around the campus. And then when he was discussing the experience with Ebony a week later, he said the most important thing for me was being shown around by the Dean and President and knowing that I was being respected in the way my forebears were not. And what's interesting is he can trace his line all the way back to before the Civil War. And those of you who listen to the NPR program, where the interviewer asked me to, it was Gerald Wanzer, who was the person who accepted the apology I issued in that interview for the way we treated his forebears. So this is complicated text. I'll just summarize it. You know, there are lots of ways you can do reparations, many, and our way is distinctive. We're one of the few to be making cash payments to descendants, and let me just briefly say why. I don't know about you, but I think most of us would love to leave something to our children, you know, in our estate. You know, you sort of want to give your children every chance they can have to thrive and survive in this complicated world of ours. So we work for ourselves, sure, and we also work to perhaps leave something that our children can benefit from. But of course, when you're never paid for your labor, then your estate is completely and utterly disadvantaged. And when you're only paid 1/5 of what your white counterparts are paid, again, your estate is significantly disadvantaged. And all this data is widely available. Everybody knows that that's the case. And that's the reason why the assets of black families in America, $23,000, and an average white person's $200,000. And that's the single greatest reason for that difference. So we thought to ourselves, okay, we can't actually pay what their labor was worth when they worked on the campus. But at the very least, we can establish the principle that their estates were disadvantaged, and therefore, yes, they get a cash payment from the seminary annually from the draw that the fund makes. And what we do, so on this graph, Eliza was the person who worked at VTS during Jim Crow. The children have gone to glory. So the 3 beneficiaries of the fund are the 3 what would be grandchildren. And they all receive a payment. So how's it going? Well, of course, this was an unknown journey. So we're navigating it slowly. The first payments, we had 32 persons we had found as beneficiaries of the fund. The endowment was valued at $1.7 million. The yield, therefore, was $74,000, and the payout was $2,100 per person. We're now in the process of making the second payout, and you can see that the numbers have increased to 112 as we do research. We have increased the value of the Reparations Endowment Fund. That's a mixture of gifts that people are making for this work, and also a decision by the Board of Trustees to increase the fund to $2.2 million. And as you can see, that we are paying out this year $1,000 per person. And that briefly explains the rationale. We're just conscious of the fact that the seminary, in the end, disadvantaged these human lives, and the labor of their forebears were not appropriately honored. And can I just say this? You know, I think the following principles, if you buy the following principles, then at least you'll understand why we're doing this. The following principles are these. First of all, people should be paid for the work they do. You know, that's a principle. We all like to be paid for our labor. The second principle is one is entitled to take of your labor and pass it on to descendants. You know, that's a good, I mean, I know that there's a big argument in our political system about death taxes. Well, this is working on the principle that, on the whole, people should be allowed to pass on to their descendants the results of their labor. And then thirdly, when those two principles have not been honoured, we should in some way or in some form seek to make repair, hence reparations. The vision underpinning all this is that, you know, we had done the apology. In 2009, I issued an apology on behalf of the institution to persons who were African American and cruelly exploited. And of course, you know, the weird thing is it continued to be hard. You talk to any of our alums through the 70s and 80s and 90s and into the 21st century, it was a hard place to be African American in. So I issued the apology. And of course, every institution wants to promise the future will be different. And that's right and proper, so we should. But part of making the claim we want the future to be different credible is that we actually do pause and do the proper act of remembering. And I know that we're not the ones who enslaved people. We're not the ones who insisted on segregation, but we are the ones who benefited from that cruel and wicked system. So we are therefore remembering, and we're making relationships with descendants, and we are making a modest contribution, and I do hope that that fund will grow as we do this work. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take questions or thoughts or comments.
So I'll start with the first question. How can we make a contribution to the endowment for VTS to continue this program?
That's a lovely question. Let the record show that there was no surreptitious please. Do you know, we would appreciate gifts. So it's very, very simple. Just mail a check, go online. There are all sorts of ways of giving, and just designate it for the Reparations Fund. And what it will then do is it goes into the endowment of the fund, and it will be part of the draw of 4% that then's paid out to these families.
Thank you so much for being here and for sharing the stories of your research and your relationships, and it's really important. Along with the exploitation of African Americans, I'm wondering if VTS has done any research into the native peoples on whose land the seminary is built?
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, we are alert and aware of the tribes who would have been those who were originally on the land before it became part of Virginia Theological Seminary. And that is part of what we want to do as we tell the complete story of our past. For me, what I'm trying to do here is just make sure we tell a narrative that's full and includes all the dimensions, the flaws as well as the faithfulness, the sin as well as the grace. And part of that is indeed recognizing the tribes on whose land we are now living and working and functioning. So we have done the research in that case, and we are looking at ways to make sure that at events people are reminded afresh of the land to whom it originally was part of the Native American heritage. Yes, please.
I have a comment and question. The first question I have is, What was the punchline in what you said? I couldn't hear what the Episcopal Church pastor said.
Oh, right. Okay, so this is my joke for the 10 o'clock, because I tell the same joke at 10:30. So my punchline was, unfortunately, was not delivered very well. So because some of these lovely people are going to the 10 o'clock
Yeah, but
service,
I got to go to work, so
I'll tell you separately. I'll
Okay,
tell you the
that's fine.
punchline separately. But yes, we'll make sure you hear the punchline.
The comment I have, well, it was a question. Do you think Martin Luther King's Cleveland Temple, that's where you did all the marches from. My question is, don't you think the Civil Rights Museum would make more sense there than where he was killed? That's a question.
Okay, thank you very much. This isn't quite in terms of my expertise, but I think I appreciate the comment and the question.
It did occur to me to share a joke with you, but I don't feel like telling a joke right now.
Right.
Reparations, as you alluded to, repair is embedded in that word. We forget that. And as a theological institution, I'd be curious to know how the conversations went on in the seminary community and in the research, and maybe going forward, as to what does repair actually look like in our world, and what contributions might we Christians make? This is one, and I suspect it will grow. Does that make sense? How does the question of repair as Christians, have you talked about that, explored it?
No, that's a very good question. I mean, one thing we're not, now I've got to be careful how I word this, but we're not trying to be trendy or progressive, right? We're just trying to be faithful, okay? And faithfulness involves, in terms of that concept of repair, you know, this is basic Christian theology. You know, if you sin and you do something wrong and you've hurt somebody, then stage one is recognizing the extent and depth of the hurt. Stage two is doing what you can to be reconciled, and reconciliation depends on some sort of attempt to do what you can to make amends, to ameliorate the breach, to repair the relationship. And then stage three is you build a new vision together, right? So that's what you do when you argue with a spouse. That's what you do when you argue with a sibling. That's what you do when you argue with a friend. That's what you do. You know, that's the work of being human. That's all that stuff that, you know, Jesus says, you got to forgive. And Peter says, what, 7 times? That sounds quite long enough. Thank you very much. And our Lord says, no, 70 times 7, like all the time. And you sit and think, that is just so crazy. Christianity is a crazy religion. That's just a ridiculous expectation. I'm pretty good at forgiving once, but the second time, you're dead. I mean, you know, but 7 times was a bit of a stretch by Peter, and 70 times 7 is like lunacy. Okay, but that is what it's all about. That's the radical nature of the kingdom. That's the expectation that God has for us. And what's true of us as individuals, true of us as institutions. So, you know, the repair that we're involved in is tell the complete story. I know we don't want to. I know we find it awkward, but that's true of our own, you know. We don't want to revisit with somebody we've hurt the crime we committed, you know, the sin we don't want to go there. We like it to stop, go away, but no. You've got to live in that place and recognize the enormity of what happened. And then, sure, the relationship building is huge. Right, so my prayer and hope is that most days at Virginia Theological Seminary, there will be in the refectory descendants who are part of this program taking advantage of the opportunity to have a meal with seminarians. And then you'll have an incarnational reminder, an embodied reminder, there every single day for lunch, of our participation in sin and our commitment for the world to be different in the future. And people will be able to sit with these families and get to know them and appreciate that, you know, there is the possibility of a future that's different from the past we're living through. So I do think that there are many facets to this, and we're in this is a story still unfolding. A huge part of it is what the campus looks like and how it feels. Another part of it is making sure that somewhere on this campus, the names of all these forgotten people are honoured, and all of that is being worked out with the families. We really do want to do something that they feel comfortable with. And it mustn't be exploitative, and it mustn't be saying, oh, look how good VTS is, or anything like that. It's got to be genuinely an act of repentance, a desire to repair the damage we caused, and a commitment to make the future different.
So it sounds like reparations have been somewhat of a complicated process at VTS. I just wonder what your thoughts are about reparations in our society and our country, especially when there's a lot of resistance to telling the truth about history.
Yeah. Right, so this is where I am slightly nervous, because although, let me just reassure you, 2010 I became an American citizen. I don't sound like one, you know. So I always like to tread carefully, and you've got to remember, I mean, the British were heinous. I mean, I come from the city of Liverpool, and that beautiful architecture in that city was all funded by the trade in enslaved persons. So it is a sin of vast proportions. And therefore, one thing let me stress this, we're not trying to necessarily model what the country should do. We're not necessarily trying to model what other institutions should do. What we're trying to do is feel our way to mark this 200-year anniversary in a way that's faithful to the things we believe of God and Christ and in the biblical witness, right? So that's really important. Having said all that, in a personal capacity, may I comment? And that is, I do think that if you are a person who believes in those two principles, the first is when people work, they should be paid. And the second is, it is appropriate for people to set aside of their earnings money that becomes part of their estate and will benefit their descendants. If you believe in those two principles, and can I just say, those of us on the political spectrum that are right of centre, those are two principles that are pretty fundamental to a right of centre identity, So if you believe in those two principles, then I think it follows the country should, recognise entire estates with disadvantage, and ways of ameliorating them should be found. And therefore, some sort of reparations program would be appropriate. But that isn't the reason we're doing this. We're doing this as an act of Christian faithfulness as we mark this significant anniversary, and we're doing this because we're deeply aware of how the story told in the past was partial, and how we need to tell the complete story, and how we need to build bridges with those whose lives were deeply disadvantaged by the cruelty of the institution. But thank you for the question. I have 10:03. I've got to go to church. Yes.
In rolling this out, did you hit opposition to this idea, or from alumni, or from just random people not included? We're more divisive now than ever in Tennessee. We pass laws that we can't teach the truth. So I'm just curious, how you responded to them. What's the how do you take someone that says you shouldn't do this, this is wrong? How have you handled that, and have you experienced that in this process?
Yes. I've got some great emails I could share, which are a little intemperate. So yes, no, this is, you know, I got the email saying, so you're disadvantaging existing students by taking money that could go to them and sticking it in endowment. You're probably spending their tuition. That's just really cruel and unfair for something that we as a generation did not do. What on earth are you doing? We did have a significant pledge to the capital campaign withdrawn. We did have people who asked to come off our mailing list because of this decision. You know, yeah, we've had, it is, as you say, a polarizing issue in the United States today, and we were being interpreted as somebody who was just being excessively woke and progressive, and I spent a lot of time talking to board members and people who were a little nervous about what was being proposed and explaining exactly the rationale and what we were trying to do, and the word council culture came up quite a lot. And so yeah, this is not, and any work in this area is going to provoke a reaction, and one's obligation in all these situations is to sit with the concern and, you know, seek to understand it and seek to take it into account as appropriate. And that's the reason why, you know, in the end, what we're trying to do here is we've got this 200th anniversary. You can't dodge it, you know. 2023 is just around the corner. We will be 200 years old. And anniversaries are significant moments. I don't know about you, but every single time I have a birthday, I'm now 59. You know, I was 58. I will soon be 60, you know. And that feels old. They're moments of appropriate, you know, analysis of one's journey and where you've been and what's happening and what you would like to do. That's the significance of all anniversaries. And therefore, for me, this is just part of the work one should do, period. And then how it's received and interpreted by others, that really is secondary. I have a responsibility as the person called by God to take an institution through this significant anniversary and to do so in a way that's appropriate to who we are. And part of that appropriateness is recognize who we were and telling the story of the past in all its detail. And do you know, one of the things I'm really quite excited about is we commissioned a play. Because how do you tell complicated stories of sin and grace? How do you tell complicated stories of faithfulness and flaws? Well, one way to do it is through drama. And so we got a play about the history of the seminary, and it made me cry. I haven't seen the play. I just went to a read-through with actors of the play. But it made me cry because I think it's there. It does capture what happened and is happening. And so the opposition's been significant. And in response, we're trying to say, look, this is something we just had to do. This was something that Christian institutions have an obligation to do. You can't follow the Lord of life. You can't follow the Christ of peace. You can't follow the Lord that calls us to anticipate a kingdom where there is justice for all without pausing and saying, okay, Lord, this is the work you've asked us to do now, and we're doing it.
Dean, we really appreciate your presence. What you've shared with us, we're taking in our heart. And I can tell by the way you talk that you have a deep and personal commitment, not just to this project, but to the whole sensitivity of building and repairing relationships in all of our lives. I hope that what you've done is not just seen as a flash-in-the-pan entrepreneurial spirit of celebrating 200 years at a university in Alexandria, but is something that could be ripple effect to the whole Christian community and to the world. That we don't We don't just whitewash our past, but we actually embrace our past and understand it and get involved locally, regionally, and nationally in this project. But thank you very much for coming, and we hope that this is live streamed so that other people can get the ripple effect of your enthusiasm, but also your sincere, humble approach to this very complex project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.